Today I would be talking about retro gaming consoles and retro computers versus emulators. So there are pros and cons to using and owning um, either one. So as for the pros of using an emulator is that it takes up almost no space. All it takes is hard drive space, and hard drive space is pretty inexpensive these days. It doesn't require any real space to use an emulator. Only hard drive space. So, and also most ROMs and games work on emulators. So, um, all of them don't work, but most of the ROMs do work. And if some don't work, some of the ROMs or games don't work, you could use another emulator to try to run those games, and most times that would work. And it costs almost no money to use an emulator on a modern computer. However, if you have a very crappy modern computer, uh, you do have to come up with the money to buy a decent computer to run emulators. And settings can be customized on emulators. You could change the resolution for emulated games. You could put the resolution as low as maybe 300 by 200 pixels, or you could put it as high as 1080p if you want. So that's the good thing about it. You can customize it, the settings, and you can also customize the graphic settings so you can make it look different, use different types of graphics themes, and you can make it look more like the original or something that's more enhanced. And emulators will run on modern computers. So you're not going to have a problem using it. They will work on most modern computers. And you can use different types of controllers. And you will have to buy the controllers. So as you can see in the bottom, you can see the various USB controllers that could be used on a modern PC, like the USB NES controller for the PC or the RetroPie. And what you see right next to it on the right is a PS1 controller to USB adapter. So this enables you to hook up a PlayStation controller to that adapter, and you can connect the USB 2.0 interface to a modern computer, and you could use a PlayStation 1 controller on your computer on an emulator. And what you see on the right of that is a Mayflash USB arcade joystick. So this would be ideal for people who are using MAMI emulators. They could basically play their arcade favorite games like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat series or whatever, and other fighting games like Samurai Showdown, etc. They could play those games with a arcade style joystick like that, a USB arcade style joystick, which they can hook up to their emulator and just use. It's just plug and play, and then you could just configure the controls to how you would want it, so you could run the game. Okay, and as for retro consoles and computers, the pros of it is that it has better controls because it comes with the original controls, like the NES original. If you bought Nintendo Entertainment System, you can basically use the original NES controller, which in my opinion was a very good controller. It was very durable, and it was just made for the Nintendo, you know. Or if you get a PlayStation 2, you could just use the PlayStation 2 controller, which is perfect for the PlayStation 2. Or if you bought a Sega Saturn, you could get the controller that came with a Sega Saturn. Or Sega Genesis would come with the original Sega Genesis controllers, which were perfect for the Genesis. You see what I mean? So it definitely has better controls for retro console systems. And all games work perfectly. Yes, for retro, if you bought the Sega Genesis, and you play Sega Genesis games on it, all the games, the cartridge games for the region would work. So if you bought the Sega Genesis for the US market, and you bought Sega Genesis games that were ported for the US market, then they would all work. There wouldn't be a problem unless the game was like defective or something. Unless the cartridge was damaged or something, then it wouldn't work. Other than that, they would all work. And if you bought a retro computer, let's say a Pentium 2 450 megahertz computer, and you ran it with Windows 98, all the games will work for Windows 98 that were produced in 1998 to 2000. They would all work perfectly. You wouldn't have any issues at all. However, if you were using an emulator, you may have some issues with some games. Some games may not work perfectly. Some games may not work at all. Other games may be a little glitchy, and that's one of the problems of using an emulator. It's never perfect. And another pro of using a retro console or a computer is that it gives you the authentic gaming experience. So if you played a game for the Sega Dreamcast on a Sega Dreamcast opposed to an emulator, you're gonna probably get the original experience for the game, you know, because that is original hardware. It's not being emulated or anything. It's just gonna work perfectly. However, if you use an emulator, you have to fiddle around with the settings to get it to work in exactly the right way. You know, you have to fiddle around with different graphic settings, speed settings, and stuff like that. And you will have to have a pretty fast computer to emulate something like a Sega Dreamcast or PlayStation 2 or PlayStation 3 or something like that, right? You're not going to be able to run a PlayStation 3 emulator on a low-end laptop, right? So you'll never get that authentic gaming experience on crappy hardware if you try to emulate it, or if you try to use a PCEM emulator, which emulates computers from 1982 to 1997. You will have to have a very good computer to emulate that, or it's going to be very choppy, slow, and it's not going to run right. So that's what I mean by having the authentic gaming experience. So if you ran it on an authentic, you know, Pentium 3 or something to run Windows 98 games, you will get the authentic experience. It will be like how it was when you played it back in 1998, or if you played a Sega Saturn on a real Sega Saturn, you're going to get the authentic experience. So that's one of the benefits of getting the retro console unit or retro computer versus using an emulator. And also, value of retro gaming consoles and computers are going up because they're not being produced. You know, so these are like collector's items basically. If you have one which is in very good condition, and you don't use it and you store it somewhere, it will become even more valuable because, like I said, there's no supply. It's not being produced. So depending on the condition and how you keep it, it may raise in value. So it could be like an investment in a way. And another benefit of using retro consoles or retro computers is that it doesn't require any skill to set up and use. So there's the ease of use, right? If you got a original NES 8-bit console system or a Famicom, it's very simple. You just plug it into your television via audio video cable, and you just plug in the controls, and just put in a cartridge and it works. Simple as that. Same thing with a Sega Genesis or whatever, or Mega Drive. Just stick it in, you just plug it into your television, plug in the controls, and plug in the cartridge, and that's it. And same thing with PlayStation 3, PlayStation 2, or whatever. Or even a retro computer, Windows 98 base computer, based on a Pentium 2 processor. All you do is you start Windows, Windows 95 or 98, and you should be able to just run games on it, just like how you used Windows 98 back in the late 90s. But that's one of the benefits of you getting a retro console or a computer. So there are also cons of using emulators, and one of those are ROMs and games don't work. And this is a common problem for all emulators. They can emulate most games. However, some games are glitchy. Some games don't work at all. That's one of the problems with using an emulator. It's not perfect. And second is there's a higher initial cost. So if you want to use an emulator, you may have to buy several different types of USB controllers. So if you want to play a Nintendo Entertainment System, you would want to get a USB NES controller to play NES games, because you don't want to play it on the keyboard. It's not very easy to play games on the keyboard, or it wouldn't be ideal using a PlayStation 2 type controller to play Nintendo games. So you'd have to invest in, like, if you want to play NES games, you will have to invest in an NES USB controller. If you want to use a PlayStation 2 emulator, you would want to get a PlayStation 2 type of USB controller. And if you want to play arcade games, like if you want to run MAME ROMs, you may want to invest in something like a May Flash USB arcade joystick. to play games like Street Fighter, because you're not going to be able to play Street Fighter on a NES controller, right? Just not going to work, because there's not enough buttons on it. And that's one of the problems you're going to face when you use an emulator. You have to have a higher initial cost, or you would have to have a powerful enough computer to run like a wide range of emulators, right? Like PCM, which I said was a computer emulator, requires you to have good hardware to run. Or if you want to use a PlayStation 2 emulator, you will have to have a pretty decent computer to run it without having slowdowns and frame skips and stuff like that, or other performance issues which will degrade your gaming experience. So another con of using an emulator is that it requires more skill to use or run. So let's say you want to use something like a Sega Dreamcast emulator, or a Sega Saturn emulator. You would have to know a lot more than just plugging in the game, or putting the CD in the game console and just turning it on. It would require a lot more than that to run perfectly, or even run at all, because you'd have to get the different BIOSes for the emulator to run the games. So there's different BIOSes for different regions. There will be probably a BIOS for games that were produced in Japan, or games that were produced for European Union, or games that were produced for South America, or games that were produced for North America. You'd have to use different ROMs, different BIOSes to run different games for different regions. So you do have to know that. And you do have to know where to put the BIOSes in the emulator to get it to run perfectly. And you'd have to go into the settings and set everything up. And you'd have to set the directories of where ROMs are so that you can run them, You would know where the ROMs are, or your emulator would know where the ROMs are. So it does require more skill to run emulators. But the good thing is that it's free. So you have sites like GOG.com, and they essentially get these older retro games to run, but they charge you money to run their games, right? Run these old games, right? They're going to charge you money for it. So the skill that the requirements that were required to run these games were done by them, so they're going to charge you money. So if you could do it yourself, it's free. However, if you cannot, then you have to pay someone else to do it, or you can't run the emulator at all. So that's one of the cons of using an emulator. And other emulators, like an NES emulator, doesn't require much skill to run. You just have to know where the directory of the ROMs or games are. You can set the controls and get it to work just like that. But I guess some people may have difficulty with that even. So if you are technically challenged or whatever, I guess the emulators are not for you. So in that, it requires skills to run. So that's one of the negatives of it. And another con is that the controllers aren't authentic, They're not the original controls. So you're not going to get the authentic feeling of the game. You could buy a controller that resembles, let's say, a Sega Genesis controller. It resembles it in some way, but it's not the original controller. Or you could buy a Sega Dreamcast-like controller, but it's not going to be the authentic Dreamcast controller. So that's about it for the cons. And there are cons to owning a retro computer or a retro console machine as well. And the first problem is that it takes up too much space. So there are a lot of video game consoles and the retro computer hardware which was released in the past. Oh man, who's this? It's nobody. Sorry about that. There were a lot of retro gaming consoles and computer hardware which was released in the past. Like you had the ZX Spectrum computer released back in the early 80s. You had the Commodore 64. You had the Commodore 128. You had the Commodore Amiga 500. Commodore Amiga 1000. The various versions of MS-DOS based PCs like the IBM XT. You had 286 based computers back in the mid 1980s. You had 386 SX based computers in for the late 1980s and early 1990s, and you had 386 DXs which were released in the early 1990s, and you had the 486 DX based computers released in the early 1990s, and you had 486 DX2 based computers which were released in around 1993, and you had the early socket 5 Pentiums which were released in probably around 1993 or something, 1993 or 1994, and you had socket 7 based Pentiums which were released from maybe 1995 to 1997, and you had slot 1 based Pentium 2s which were released around 1998, and all these other things. You had the Amstrad computer, various types released in the early 1980s, mid 1980s. You have all this different type of hardware, right? And you have for gaming consoles, you had the Nintendo Entertainment System, you had the Sega Master System, you had the Game Boy, the Sega Game Gear, you had the Sega Genesis, you had the TurboGrafx 16, you had the Super Graphics from NEC, you had all this, or the TurboGrafx Dual, you had the Neo Geo arcade console, which was an arcade home console, both. And you have the Super Nintendo, you had I don't know if I said the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. You had that. You had the Sega CD. You had the Sega. You had the Sega Saturn after that, which was a 32-bit system. The Nintendo 64 or N64. You had what else? The PlayStation 1. You had the PlayStation 2, the Sega Dreamcast, and that would all be retro too. I don't know if PlayStation 3 is retro, but they also have PlayStation 3 emulators as well. So you have all this different hardware. You also have the Apple II series of computers. You had Apple II Plus, Apple IIc, Apple IIe, Apple II GS. You had Macintosh, and all these other computers. There's so many computers, and video gaming consoles that you're not going to be able to put all that in your house. It's practically impossible. But as for an emulator, you could just get like maybe a 2 terabyte hard drive, and I'm pretty sure you could put most of the games in the emulators in a 2 terabyte hard drive, or maybe you could have like 3 or 4 terabyte hard drives, 2 terabyte hard drive, and you could put all the games and emulators in it, and you could use it, with a hard drive dock or something. And that would take up infinitely less space than using the original hardware. The original hardware is nice, but who's gonna have the space to accommodate for all that, huh? And another bad thing about retro consoles and retro computers is that it is very expensive. So over the years, maybe the past 5 to 10 years, a lot of people have been buying console gaming systems, and making videos about it on YouTube and other social networking sites, and people have had a renewed interest in these types of games, right? Because people are promoting it on their videos and stuff. So as the years went by, these things have gotten pretty expensive, Now let me give you some examples. Let me look it up. Let me try to find the original NES console and see how much it costs. Okay, a good example would be the NES Classic Edition. This was released by Nintendo. It's called a Nintendo Mini, and I think it came with exactly how many games, because the ones I'm looking at are modded. Nintendo Mini. So the Nintendo Mini was released a couple of years ago, and it came with 30 games in it, and it was released by Nintendo. It costs about $92. Okay, that's I guess reasonable. Yeah, that is pretty reasonable. Yeah, you could buy a used Nintendo console for as little as maybe $90, $90. I guess that's reasonable. But however, if you keep buying consoles, it's gonna use up a lot of your space, and it's definitely more expensive compared to using an emulator. Yeah, that's the thing about it. So, and other, and that's just one console. I'm gonna look at another console, Atari Jaguar. Okay, on eBay I found an Atari Jaguar for about $369.99, and it goes as low as $152.50. So it is definitely more expensive than an emulator again, and these are just some of the systems. You have so many more. For the Atari, you had the Atari 2600, you had the Atari 50, I don't know, was it the 5200? Yeah, the Atari 5200 and the Atari 7800 and Atari ST computer, Atari X, Atari computer. I think it was Atari 800 computer, 800 XL computer, and all these other types. Definitely, some of these Atari 800 computers cost anywhere from $100 to $400. If it comes with an original box, it would cost $400. So it would be an expensive hobby to collect actual retro hardware. So let me look up another one. Pentium 3 computer. Okay, there's a Gateway Pentium 3 computer. Someone selling for $69. It's a Pentium 3 450. Okay, they do sell it. This one's pretty reasonable. And they have another Dell Business Industrial Pentium 3, Windows 98, $499.95. I guess they vary in price, but it is certainly more expensive than using an emulator. So that's another con of using retro hardware, is that it's expensive and it takes up a lot of space. So video outputs for retro gaming consoles like the original Nintendo may not work on modern TVs, because a lot of modern TVs today have like I think they only have like DVI ports, so you're gonna have a pretty hard time using a retro gaming console on a modern LED television. So that's one of the problems you'll have. And lastly, console hardware might fail. So let's say you bought a Sega Genesis game console on eBay or whatever, or you went to a garage sale and you found one. These things are very old. They're anywhere from let's say 20 to 33 years old. That's pretty old. So that you could have problems with these machines, and that the capacitors could have leaked electrolytes onto the board, and that could have corroded the board. So the board is damaged, and capacitors often do fail like this. Over time, they do leak onto the board and damage it. So they could fail anytime, and that's one of the risks you'll have to take with buying retro used retro computers or video game consoles. But you could buy a Pentium 2 or a Pentium 3 on eBay, or you could buy it from some garage sale or whatever, and it may work today, but maybe in a week from now, or a couple of months, or maybe a year from now, it may not work. It may stop working. So hardware does fail. So that's one of the problems with it. Okay, thanks for watching.